The Hart estate was just as Evelyn remembered, grand, cold, and painfully polished. White marble floors, oil paintings of ancestors who stared down in silent judgment, and furniture too expensive to sit on. It smelled of citrus polish and expensive regret. She hadn't stepped foot inside the house since the day they'd sent her away as a joke. And now here she was, walking back through the front doors, not with shame, but with something else entirely. Purpose. She was showing, just slightly enough to be noticed, especially by people who had once claimed it would never happen. Her loose coat didn't hide the subtle curve of her stomach, and she didn't try to cover it up. Her mother was the first to greet her, arms open, voice sweet and sugary. "Darling, you look wonderful. Pregnancy suits you. You finally filled out a bit." Evelyn didn't hug her back. "Thanks." They led her into the drawing room where the rest of the family was waiting. Her father, sitting tall like a CEO hosting a board meeting. Her sister, glowing in designer maternity wear, holding her third child on her hip. Aunts, uncles, cousins all gathered with smiles too wide and eyes too calculating. To them, this was a victory. The infertile daughter had finally come home, finally useful. Redeemed by a baby she wasn't supposed to have. Her father poured her a glass of water like it was a glass of wine. "We've been talking, Evelyn. There's a house just a few blocks from here. We'd like to gift it to you to raise the child close to family. You'll want support. And a proper education, resources. And a trust fund, of course," her sister added, brushing imaginary lint from her blouse. "After all, you've had a rough go of it. This baby deserves everything we can give." Evelyn looked at the room, at the people who had ignored her pain, dismissed her worth, and shoved her off to a ranch as a joke, and she smiled. It was a quiet, devastating smile, the kind that made people shift in their seats. "You all think this baby changes the story, don't you?" Her father frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, stepping forward, "you think this child erases what you did. You think suddenly I'm valuable again, redeemable, that I've finally done something worthy of the Hart name." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "Evelyn, no one. You sent me away," Evelyn interrupted, voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You called it a joke, a little getaway. But you wanted me gone. You thought I was broken, barren, embarrassing." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. "And now that I'm carrying something you want, your legacy, you're trying to pull me back in. With gifts. With offers. With control." She looked around. "But I'm not that woman anymore. I'm not yours to fix or hide or pity." Her sister scoffed. "So what, this rancher knocks you up and now you think you're above us?" Evelyn turned to her, eyes cool. "No, I think I finally found someone who sees me as a person, not a defective product." Her father tried to regain control. "Evelyn, don't be dramatic. Think about the child." "I am thinking about the child," she said. "And I won't raise them in a house where love is conditional and value is based on performance. I'd rather live in a one-room shack with Wyatt than in a mansion filled with people who only love me when I'm useful." Her mother looked wounded, but Evelyn knew better. It wasn't pain, it was pride, bruised and bleeding. Then a surprising voice spoke up. Her perfect sister, Evia. She said softly, eyes glistening. "They treat me like a baby factory, like I don't exist outside of the kids. And the truth is, I don't even know who I am anymore." Everyone turned to her, stunned. Evelyn stared at her sister, finally seeing the cracks in the porcelain mask. Maybe they weren't so different after all. But she couldn't save her. "Not now. I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "I really am. But I'm choosing a different life." She turned and walked out. No tears. No dramatics. Just the quiet strength of a woman who'd finally taken her power back. Outside, the air felt lighter, freer. She got in the car, placed a hand over her belly, and smiled. She'd kept her promise to Wyatt. She came back, but only to say goodbye. Evelyn didn't cry on the flight back to Montana. She didn't replay the arguments or second-guess the decision she'd made. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to earn anyone's approval. She wasn't performing. She wasn't asking to be loved. She had chosen herself, and now she was going home. The sky was turning gold as the plane descended, the sprawling landscape of Montana welcoming her back like an old friend. Fields stretched endlessly, kissed by late afternoon light, and the mountains rose like sleeping giants. Still and protective, Wyatt was waiting for her at the tiny airport, leaning against his truck, arms crossed. He looked calm, but his eyes, those flint gray eyes, were scanning the crowd with quiet urgency. When he saw her, his shoulders dropped in relief. Evelyn didn't run to him. She walked steady and sure, suitcase in one hand and her other resting on the small swell of her belly. Wyatt didn't say anything right away. He just pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. And maybe she was. "I told you I'd come back," she whispered into his shirt. He nodded, voice low. "Didn't doubt you." Not for a second. Back at the ranch, everything felt both exactly the same and completely new. The familiar creak of the wooden porch, the scent of pine and earth in the air, the distant sounds of horses moving through pasture, it all wrapped around Evelyn like a warm quilt. But this time, she wasn't just visiting. She wasn't hiding. She was home. Wyatt had kept the place running smoothly in her absence, but there were subtle changes. The guest room she'd stayed in was now painted a soft cream color, with folded baby clothes on the dresser and a rocking chair in the corner. Her boots were still by the door. Her favorite mug sat on the kitchen shelf, clean and waiting. He hadn't touched the treehouse, but he'd cleared the overgrown path leading to it. "I didn't know if you'd want to keep it," he said one evening, as they stood looking up at the structure silhouetted by the setting sun. "I do," Evelyn replied, her hand resting on her belly. "I want this child to know everything, the good and the hard." They stood there together, fingers intertwined, watching the wind rustle through the trees like a blessing. The months passed quickly. Evelyn's belly grew round, her movements slower, but her spirit lighter than it had ever been. She and Wyatt made plans in their quiet. Uncomplicated wake cribs, midwives, baby names murmured in bed after long days of work. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they laughed until they cried. It wasn't perfect. It was real. The town accepted her in the way small towns do, with a mix of curiosity, kindness, and gossip. But Evelyn didn't care. She no longer needed to be understood by everyone, just loved by the ones who mattered. And Wyatt loved her, fiercely, steadily, without conditions. One night in late spring, under a velvet sky dotted with stars, Evelyn gave birth in their home with Wyatt by her side. His hand never leaving hers. It was a girl. They named her June, after Wyatt's mother and Evelyn's favorite month on the ranch. When they placed June in Evelyn's arms, she wept not out of grief or fear, but from the overwhelming, quiet joy of it all, of having defied every expectation, of holding proof in her arms that life wasn't over just because it didn't follow the script. She looked at Wyatt, who kissed her forehead and whispered, "She looks just like you." "No," Evelyn said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "She looks like hope." Weeks later, the porch was once again their favorite place. Evelyn sat in the old rocking chair, June swaddled in her arms, the baby's tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Wyatt came out with 2 mugs coffee for himself, herbal tea for her. "She finally asleep?" he asked. Evelyn smiled, nodding. "Out like a light. She loves the wind." Wyatt sat beside her, their legs touching. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Then Evelyn looked down at her daughter, then up at Wyatt. Not bad for a joke, huh? Wyatt chuckled, leaned over, and kissed her. No, he murmured. Not bad at all. Evelyn had been sent away as a family punchline. The broken one. The discard. The woman no one expected anything from. But she came back with something more powerful than revenge or vindication. She came back with love. With peace. With a future, and a child who would never have to wonder if she was enough, because she was raised by a mother who finally knew that she was. Evelyn had always imagined that if this day ever came, if she ever found herself pregnant, she would feel only joy. That she would collapse in tears, call everyone she knew, post it to the world in a flurry of excitement and hope. But reality was more complicated. She sat alone on the ranch porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, her hand resting gently on her belly. 8 weeks. A miracle by every definition. And yet, Evelyn felt more afraid than anything else. Afraid it was a mistake. Afraid the child wouldn't make it. Afraid that this sliver of happiness would be stolen away her. Self-worth had been so many times before. She hadn't told Wyatt, not yet. He had been patient with her, supportive, kind. But he didn't know what this pregnancy meant, not just physically, but symbolically. It defied years of medical certainty, her family's judgment, and everything Evelyn had come to believe about her own body. So she waited. She tried to carry on like normal, though nausea and fatigue made ranch work nearly impossible. Wyatt noticed, of course. He wasn't a fool. One morning, as she pushed her eggs around on her plate, he finally asked, "You sick, Evia?" She blinked. No, just tired. He gave her a look. A long, quiet one. But he didn't press. It wasn't until a week later, when he found her throwing up behind the barn, that she finally broke. She sat in the hay, knees pulled to her chest, too dizzy to argue. "I'm pregnant," she said softly, not even looking at him. Wyatt stared at her like the wind had been knocked from his chest. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then he knelt beside her, gently lifting her chin. "Say that again." "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I didn't think it was possible." No one did. Wade's eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, wonder, disbelief, and something very close to awe. "You sure?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. 8 weeks. I went to a clinic in town. He didn't speak. He just pulled her into his arms and held her there, in the quiet, where the only sound was the wind brushing through the grass and Evelyn's breath catching in her throat. But the peace didn't last long. Word traveled faster than she expected. A local farmhand who had seen her at the clinic mentioned it to someone else, and within days, the news somehow made it back to her family. It started with a phone call. Her mother's voice was falsely sweet, full of concern. "Evelyn, darling, we heard the most incredible news. Why didn't you tell us?" Then came the letters, the gifts, the invitations to come home and raise the child properly. Her father offered to put her in a house near the estate, complete with a nursery and staff. Her sister wrote her a long message about how important family unity was, especially for a child, but none of it was about Evelyn. It was about the baby. The infertile daughter had suddenly become valuable again, proof that their bloodline hadn't ended with her. She could almost hear them rewriting the story, pretending the years of ridicule and dismissal hadn't happened. Her child was a redemption arc for them, not for her. Wyatt saw her wrestle with it. She didn't hide the letters. She didn't need to. "Are you thinking about going back?" he asked one evening as they sat under the stars. "I don't know," she admitted. "They're offering stability, resources, security." Wyatt's jaw clenched. "They didn't care about you before." "Why now?" "Because I have something they want." Wyatt nodded slowly. I won't beg you to stay. That's not who I am. But I'll raise this baby with you. I'll be here. If you want me." She looked at him, this man who had taken her in without expectation, who had loved her without asking for anything in return. A man who built things with his hands and meant every word he said. And yet she hesitated, not because she didn't love him, but because, deep down, the voice of her family still lingered, whispering doubts. "You're not enough. You need them." Evelyn knew she had to make a decision. Not just for the child growing inside her, but for herself. To break free of the chains her family had wrapped around her. To finally choose her own future. On her own terms, she packed her bag quietly one morning, kissed Wyatt goodbye, and said, "I'll be back. I promise." And then she boarded a plane to face the family that had discarded her, this time not as the infertile daughter, but as a woman with something they never expected: power. By the third month, Evelyn had stopped counting the days. She no longer woke up longing for the sterile comfort of city living or bracing herself for the judgment of her family. The ranch had worked its way into her bones, its rhythm, its stillness, its wild demands. And Wyatt Langston, with all his quiet intensity, had worked his way into her heart. They didn't talk about feelings. They didn't need to. Connection between them wasn't loud or romantic in the traditional sense. It was built in the long silences after a hard day's work, in the shared glances over steaming mugs of coffee, in the small, wordless gestures, a hand on her back, guiding her away from a charging steer, a blanket he left folded on the porch swing on chilly mornings. But one night, all of that unspoken tension came to a head. It was late. A storm had rolled in, fierce and sudden, rattling the barn doors and sending the livestock into a frenzy. Evelyn helped Wyatt herd the frightened animals into shelter, rain soaking them both to the skin. She slipped in the mud, cursing as she fell, and Wyatt was there in an instant, pulling her up, holding her close. "Stubborn city girl," he muttered.
Brushing hair from her face, she laughed, breathless, soaked, and shivering.
"Takes one to know one." Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked. And before either of them could overthink it, Wyatt kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was raw and hungry, like something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. She kissed him back with equal desperation, clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to wash her away. They made love that night in the old ranch house, wrapped in each other beneath layers of quilt and thunder. It wasn't perfect or planned, but it felt real, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt wanted, not for her potential to give someone a child, but simply for being herself. The morning after was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Wyatt made breakfast. Evelyn fed the horses. They didn't speak about what had happened, but something had shifted. There was more softness between them now, more meaning in the way he looked at her. And yet, beneath that new tenderness, Evelyn felt the old fear creeping in. She hadn't told Wyatt everything. He didn't know about the failed treatments, the years of medical bills, the quiet heartbreak of every test that came back negative. He didn't know she had been labeled infertile, that her family had written her off as a genetic dead end. In a way, she was afraid to tell him, afraid that once he knew, the warmth in his eyes would fade like everyone else's. But it wasn't just her hiding something. Wyatt, too, was guarded. He never talked about his past, not really. One evening, while tending to a sick calf, he let slip that he'd tried to adopt a little boy once, a foster child named Danny. Evelyn listened quietly as he told her how the boy had grown to love the ranch, only to be taken back by the system 6 months later. "I built him a treehouse," Wyatt said, his voice rough. "It's still there. I never took it down." Evelyn didn't know what to say, so she didn't. She just stood beside him in silence, her hand brushing his. A week later, Evelyn began to feel off. She was tired, dizzy. Certain smells made her nauseous. At first, she thought it was the flu or maybe exhaustion. But then the thought struck her ridiculous, impossible. Still, she bought a test. It sat on the bathroom counter for hours. Before she dared to look positive. Her knees buckled. Tears streamed down her face, not of joy. Not yet, but of confusion, disbelief, and raw, unfiltered fear. This couldn't be real. It shouldn't be possible. Every doctor had told her she'd never carry a child. She didn't tell Wyatt right away. How could she? What if it was a mistake? What if she lost it again? She visited a local clinic in town under a false name. Blood work confirmed it. She was 8 weeks pregnant. 8 weeks. Around the time of the storm. Back at the ranch, Wyatt sensed something had changed. He watched her more closely, his worry masked by quiet observation. But he didn't push. One night, Evelyn stood outside beneath the stars, a hand on her stomach. She was terrified. But she was also something else. Hopeful. She wasn't sure what this miracle meant, or what her future looked like, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her life was no longer just her own. The first morning on the Langston Ranch was a shock to Evelyn's carefully managed system. There were no gentle wake-ups, no coffee brewed by a barista, and no soft silk sheets. Instead, the rooster's cry came at dawn, the floors creaked under her sore feet, and the scent of hay, dirt, and manure was unmistakable. Her back ached from the old mattress, and the wind howled through gaps in the window frame, carrying with it the promise of hard labor. But Evelyn Hart, despite what her family believed, was not weak. She pulled on borrowed jeans and worn boots, tied her hair into a tight knot, and walked out into the chilly Montana morning. The sky was breathtaking, endless, and raw, and the mountains in the distance looked like silent watchers. Ancient and unmoved. Wyatt Langston was already in the barn. Sleeves rolled up, hat low over his brow, feeding horses like it was second nature. He barely acknowledged her when she walked in. "You're late," he said without looking up. "It's 6:30, she replied, shivering slightly. "Exactly." Their interactions were short and clipped. Wyatt was a man of few words, and Evelyn quickly learned he didn't tolerate laziness, excuses, or pity. He handed her a pitchfork and pointed her toward the stables. She gagged once at the smell but gritted her teeth and got to work. The first few days were brutal. Her hands blistered. Her nails broke. Her back throbbed from lifting bales of hay, and she was sure her arms had never moved this much in her life. Wyatt didn't coddle her. If she fell behind, he didn't wait. If she messed up, he made her do it again. But oddly enough, he never mocked her, never treated her with the passive aggression or fake smile she was used to back home. He treated her like someone capable of doing more. And Evelyn, desperate to prove him right, pushed herself harder. As the days stretched into weeks, something began to shift. The animals started to calm around her. She learned the rhythm of the land, the way the sun hit the barn just before noon, the sound the creek made at night, the low murmurs of cattle before a storm. She learned to ride, to clean, to repair fences. The muscles in her body screamed, but her soul felt oddly quiet, settled. Wyatt, though still guarded, began to soften in small ways. He showed her how to mend a saddle. He shared pieces of his routine, like how he tracked the weather or which herbs he used to treat a sick calf. One evening, after a long day of branding, he handed her a cold beer without a word and sat beside her on the porch. They watched the stars come out in silence. Over time, Wyatt became less of a mystery. Evelyn learned that he'd inherited the ranch from his grandfather and had been running it alone since his teenage years. He never married, never had kids. He'd tried to foster once a boy who stayed for 6 months before being taken away. Wyatt didn't talk about it, but the way his eyes tightened at the memory told her enough. She also noticed how he treated the animals, especially the injured or abandoned ones. There was a tenderness beneath his rugged surface, a kind of quiet, dependable love that asked for nothing in return. Evelyn found herself drawn to it. To him. Still, she tried to remind herself of the truth. She was only here because her family didn't want her around. This life, the ranch, the mountains, Wyatt wasn't hers to keep. It was temporary. A cruel joke. And yet, she began to laugh more. Sleep better. Wake up feeling hopeful. One afternoon, she slipped and twisted her ankle while chasing a goat that had escaped its pen. Wyatt rushed over without a word, lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing, and carried her back to the porch. She tried to joke through the pain, but he just sat beside her, carefully wrapping her foot, his hands gentle. "You don't have to prove anything," he said softly. Not meeting her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, more to herself than him. "I do." They locked eyes then. Something passed between them, wordless but powerful. Vulnerability, recognition, maybe even the start of something deeper, but neither spoke of it. Not yet. Instead, Evelyn watched the sunset over the ranch that night with her leg propped up and a strange flutter in her chest. She didn't know what was happening between her and Wyatt, or even within herself, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't ashamed to feel it. She was beginning to believe that life, real, messy, beautiful life, might still be possible, even for someone like her, even out here in the middle of nowhere. Evelyn Hart had always been the family disappointment. In a lineage of overachievers, heirs, and picture-perfect family photos, Evelyn was the one shadow no one spoke about unless it was in a whisper or behind a glass of wine at dinner parties. At 29, she was the only Hart daughter not married, not working for the family business, and worst of all in their eyes, unable to bear children. After years of fertility treatments, 2 miscarriages, and a cold, clinical diagnosis stamped into her medical file like a death sentence, her family began to treat her differently. First came the subtle changes. Her mother stopped inviting her to family planning brunches. Her sister didn't ask her to be a godmother. And her father avoided conversations about legacy. Eventually, the distance hardened into quiet scorn, pity wrapped in pearls and patronizing smiles. Evelyn, despite the pain, had learned to keep her head high. But nothing could have prepared her for what they did next. It happened during a family gathering at the estate, a sprawling colonial mansion tucked into New Hampshire's countryside. Her sister was announcing her 3rd pregnancy, and champagne flutes clinked as the family cheered. Evelyn stood at the edge of the room, a polite smile plastered across her face, her insides hollow. Later that evening, her father called her into the study. Her mother, brother-in-law, and a few aunts were there, their faces carefully composed. "We've been thinking," her mother began, tone light like they were discussing a vacation. "It might be good for you to get away. A change of pace. A sabbatical," her father added. "Time to reset, reflect, heal." Evelyn blinked. Heal from what? No one answered. Her cousin, the family's go-to problem solver, chimed in. "There's this ranch out west, in Montana. Old family friend runs it, Wyatt Langston. Big property. Beautiful skies. It'll do you good. Wyatt Langston?" Evelyn asked, confused. She had never heard the name before. "He's a rancher," her mother said, waving a hand dismissively. "Rougher on the edges type, single, no kids. Perfectly harmless." Evelyn frowned. "Why would I go live with a rancher?" The room went awkwardly silent. Her sister let out a barely stifled laugh. Evelyn's stomach turned. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an exile. In truth, they thought sending her to the middle of nowhere would keep her out of sight, away from family events and prying socialites. They assumed a city-raised woman like Evelyn would come running home after a week of cow dung and hard labor. But underneath the cruel joke was something darker, an unspoken belief that she had no value anymore. Not to them. Not as a heart, not as a woman. Evelyn sat in silence for a long moment. Every instinct in her body screamed to refuse, to stand, to shout, to call out the cruelty of it all. But instead, she took a long breath, smoothed her dress, and smiled. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll go." Her family exchanged surprised glances. They had expected resistance, maybe a breakdown. What they didn't expect was acceptance. Evelyn didn't give them the satisfaction of explaining herself. She packed up her modest apartment in Boston, left a job she'd never loved, and booked a one-way ticket to Montana. The day she arrived at the Langston Ranch, the sky was wide and unfiltered, stretching like a promise over golden fields. The ranch house stood against the landscape like something out of a storybook, wooden, weathered, and stubbornly proud. Horses grazed in the distance. The air smelled like earth and honesty. Wyatt Langston met her at the gate. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-worn skin and eyes like flint, he looked her up and down once with an unreadable expression. "You're the heart girl?" he asked. Evelyn gave a small smile. "Apparently." He shrugged. "You won't last a week." Evelyn squared her shoulders, something steely igniting in her chest. "Watch me." She didn't cry that night, even though she slept in a room that smelled like hay and loneliness. She didn't text anyone back home. Instead, she wrote in a journal she hadn't touched in years. "They think I'm a joke, but jokes are remembered." She was determined. This wasn't just exile. It was a chance. Evelyn Hart may have come to the ranch as a discarded daughter, a family inconvenience, but she had no idea that this harsh, wild land and the man who worked it would change everything, even her fate.